50,000 people packed into the Roman Colosseum were there to watch you die. The screams, the smell of blood, and the terror of death. Being a gladiator was the most horrifying job in the world. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year was 73 CE, and Marcus had never imagined his life would end in sand soaked with blood. Just 6 months earlier, he had been a free man, a farmer working his small plot of land outside Rome. Now as he stood in the courtyard of the gladiator school at Capua, iron shackles cutting into his wrists, he understood with crystal clarity that his old life was over. The path to becoming a gladiator wasn't one anyone chose willingly. There were essentially 3 ways a man found himself in the ludus, the gladiator training school. And none of them involved glory or honor. The first and most common route was slavery. When Roman legions conquered new territories, they didn't just take land, they took people. Prisoners of war, particularly those who had shown skill in battle, were often earmarked for the arena. The logic was brutal, but simple. If they could fight for their homeland, they could die for Rome's entertainment. Marcus had taken the second path, debt slavery. When successive crop failures left him unable to pay his taxes, the local magistrate had offered him a choice. He could sell himself into gladiator training for a period of 5 years, with the promise that his family's debts would be forgiven and they would receive a small stipend. The alternative was debtor's prison, which was essentially a slow death sentence. So Marcus had signed the contract, pressed his thumb to the wax, and condemned himself to what he thought would be 5 years of hard training and occasional fights. He had no idea that the average lifespan of a gladiator was measured in months, not years. The third route to the arena was perhaps the most straightforward. Crime, murderers, thieves, deserters from the army, and those guilty of treason against the state could be sentenced to the arena. These men were called Noxi, and they were given the worst assignments: fights against wild animals with no armor, or mass battles where survival was nearly impossible. They weren't expected to live long enough to become skilled fighters. They were human sacrifices dressed up as entertainment. The gladiator school at Capua was one of the largest and most famous in the empire, but it was nothing like the grand academies Marcus had imagined. The moment he passed through its gates, he was stripped of everything that had once defined him. His name, his family, his past, all of it was irrelevant now. He was given a number, a crude tunic, and a sleeping space in a cell barely large enough for a man to lie down. The cells were arranged around a central courtyard where the training took place. Each cell housed 2 men, and privacy was non-existent. A bucket in the corner served as a toilet, and it was emptied once a day if the inhabitants were lucky. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear, and death all mingled into a nauseating cloud that seemed to permeate every stone of the building. Sleep was nearly impossible, not just because of the discomfort, but because of the sounds. Men wept in the darkness. Others prayed to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Some mumbled in languages Marcus didn't recognize. Gauls, Germans, Africans, all thrown together in this pit of human misery. And occasionally there were men who broke under the pressure of their situation, who clawed at the walls until their fingers bled, who begged the guards to just kill them and end their suffering. The guards were former gladiators themselves, men who had somehow survived long enough to earn their freedom, but had nowhere else to go. They showed no mercy to the new recruits, because they had received none themselves. Weakness was not tolerated. Fear was not comforted. The only thing that mattered was whether you could learn to kill efficiently and die entertainingly. Marcus's first morning began before dawn with the clanging of metal on metal. The guards moved through the cells, shouting for the men to get up, to move, to line up in the courtyard. Those who moved too slowly received kicks or blows from wooden staves. One man, a Gallic warrior with arms like tree trunks, refused to get up. The guards didn't argue with him. They simply beat him until he was unconscious, then dragged him away. Marcus never saw him again. The morning meal was a cruel joke. A piece of bread that might have been fresh a week ago. A thin gruel that tasted like water with a few grains of barley stirred in. And if they were fortunate, a piece of cheese so old it had turned green around the edges. This was their fuel for a day of training that would push their bodies to the absolute limit. The training master was a scarred veteran named Gaius, who had fought in the arena for nearly 8 years before earning his freedom. His body was a map of near-death experiences. A deep gash across his forehead where a trident had nearly split his skull, a twisted left arm that had been broken by a warhammer and never healed properly, and dozens of smaller scars that crisscrossed his torso like a spider's web. He looked at the new recruits with the expression of a butcher examining cattle. "You are already dead," Gaius announced to the group of 30 men who had arrived that week. "The moment you walked through those gates, your lives ended. What stands before me now are ghosts, shadows, nothing more. Some of you will last a few weeks. A lucky few might survive a few months. 1 or 2 of you might live long enough to earn your freedom. But statistically speaking, that's unlikely." He gestured toward the walls of the courtyard, where wooden weapons hung in neat rows. "These will become extensions of your body. You will eat with them, sleep with them, and eventually die with them. You will train 12 hours a day, every day, until your muscles scream and your bones ache and your mind breaks. And then you will train some more." The physical preparation was only part of the horror. Psychologically, the gladiator school was designed to strip away everything that made a man human. Names were replaced with numbers or fighting titles. Families were forgotten. Personal histories were erased. The only identity that mattered was whether you were a secutor, a retiarius, a thraix, or any of the other specialized fighting styles that would determine how you lived and died in the arena. Marcus was designated as a secutor, a gladiator type, that fought with a large rectangular shield and a short sword. The secutor was traditionally matched against the retiarius, the net fighter, in one of the most popular combinations in the arena. The secutor's helmet was smooth and rounded, designed to prevent a net from catching on it, but it also severely limited vision and made breathing difficult. It was like fighting while looking through a narrow slot and gasping for air through a metal grill. The training weapons were made of wood and weighted with lead to build strength. A real gladius, the short sword carried by Roman soldiers, weighed about 2 pounds. The training version weighed nearly 6 pounds, and after swinging it for hours at a time, a recruit's arm would shake so violently he couldn't hold a cup of water. The shield, too, was heavier than its arena counterpart. In combat, gladiators used shields made of layered wood and leather that were both strong and light. In training, they carried solid wood shields that felt like they weighed as much as a grown man. Day after day, week after week, the routine was the same. Wake before dawn, eat slop, train until your body collapsed. Eat more slop, sleep if you could manage it, despite the pain, then wake up and do it all again. The training was not just about learning to fight. It was about learning to endure suffering beyond anything most men had ever experienced. And all the while, hanging over everything like a storm cloud, was the knowledge that this was all preparation for one thing: entertaining the crowds while you died. The arena awaited, and in the arena, mercy was a luxury that neither gladiators nor spectators could afford. The sun had not yet risen when the iron bell began its merciless clanging, echoing off the stone walls of the gladiator school, like the toll of death itself. Marcus jerked awake on his straw mattress, his body already aching from the previous day's training. The man beside him, a former Germanic warrior named Klaus, groaned and rolled over, revealing fresh bruises across his back where the training master's staff had found its mark. Up, up, you worthless dogs. The voice of Brutus, one of the veteran guards, cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a whip crack. The sound of his hobnailed boots on stone grew closer to their cell, accompanied by the rhythmic thud of his wooden club against the iron bars. Move like you want to live another day. Marcus had learned in his first week that hesitation meant pain. He rolled off the thin mattress and onto the cold stone floor, his joints protesting every movement. Around him, 30 other men were performing the same grim morning ritual, dragging themselves from fitful sleep into another day of systematic torture disguised as training. The cells were barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls that wept moisture and a ceiling so low that Klaus, who stood nearly 7 feet tall, had to perpetually hunch his shoulders. A single small window, barred with iron and positioned too high to see through, allowed a meager amount of light to filter in. The floor was nothing but packed earth, cold and damp, with a thin layer of straw that was changed perhaps once a month. In one corner sat a clay pot that served as their toilet, and the smell from it permeated everything: their clothes, their hair, their dreams. Privacy was an alien concept. Marcus and Klaus shared every moment of their existence, eating from the same bowl, sleeping inches apart, learning each other's fears and weaknesses whether they wanted to or not. Klaus spoke little Latin, communicating mostly through grunts and gestures, but Marcus had learned that the Germanic giant had been a chief among his people before Roman legions had swept through his village. Now he was just another piece of meat being prepared for slaughter. The morning routine began with what the guards mockingly called ablutions, a cold water wash from a communal trough that was little more than a stone basin fed by a single pipe. The water was brown and often frozen in winter, but the gladiators were expected to clean themselves as best they could. Personal hygiene was not about comfort or health. It was about making sure they looked presentable when they died for the crowd's entertainment. Breakfast was served in the main courtyard, where all the gladiators gathered at long wooden tables that had been scarred by countless knives and stained with spilled food and blood. The meal never varied: a thick porridge made from barley and water, occasionally enriched with a few beans or a scrap of meat, so tough it could barely be chewed. The bread was dark and heavy, often moldy around the edges, and the ale was watered down to the point where it barely qualified as such. But it wasn't just the quality of the food that made mealtimes miserable. It was the atmosphere of controlled violence that permeated every aspect of their existence. The gladiators were arranged by fighting style and experience level, creating a rigid hierarchy that was enforced through brutality. Veterans sat closest to the food distribution point and took the largest portions. New recruits like Marcus sat at the far end and got whatever scraps remained. Fights over food were common and encouraged by the guards. They would deliberately serve smaller portions to certain tables, then stand back and watch as hunger drove men to violence. A gladiator who couldn't fight for his breakfast wasn't likely to survive in the arena, so these conflicts served as both entertainment and evaluation for the training staff. Marcus watched one morning as two men fought over a piece of cheese that was barely larger than a coin. The older gladiator, a veteran of at least a dozen arena fights, grabbed the younger man's wrist and twisted it until bones snapped. The sound was like a dry branch breaking, followed immediately by a scream that seemed to go on forever. The guards laughed and applauded while the injured man cradled his ruined hand against his chest, tears streaming down his face. There would be no medical attention, no sympathy, no justice, only the lesson that weakness was punished swiftly and without mercy. After breakfast came the training, and this was where the true horror of gladiator school revealed itself. The courtyard was surrounded by wooden posts of various heights, each one scarred and splintered from countless hours of sword work. Hanging from brackets on the walls were practice weapons, wooden swords weighted with lead, shields made from solid oak, spears with blunted tips that could still crack ribs, and nets with lead weights that could break bones if swung with enough force. The training master, Gaius, divided the gladiators into groups based on their designated fighting styles. The secutorers, like Marcus, trained with heavy rectangular shields and short swords. The rhetari learned to handle nets and tridents with deadly precision. The thrices practiced with small round shields and curved swords. Each group had its own specialized techniques, its own brutal training regimen, and its own specific ways of dying in the arena. For the secutorers, training began with basic sword work against wooden posts. The wooden gladius was so heavy that after 10 minutes of continuous striking, Marcus's arm felt like it was on fire. But there was no rest, no respite. Gaius walked among the trainees with a long wooden staff, striking anyone whose form was imperfect, whose stance was wrong, whose sword work was sloppy. "You're not chopping wood, you fool." Gaius's staff caught Marcus across the shoulders, sending him stumbling forward into the training post. A gladius is a thrusting weapon. You stab, you twist, you withdraw. Again, the training posts were covered in straw and leather to simulate human bodies. But after hours of abuse, they began to fall apart, exposing the hard wood underneath. Marcus's knuckles were soon bloody from where his hand had slipped down the sword grip and scraped against the rough wood. His shoulders ached from holding the heavy shield in position. His legs trembled from maintaining the proper fighting stance hour after hour. But physical pain was only the beginning. The psychological torture was far more sophisticated and far more damaging. Gaius and the other trainers were experts at breaking men's spirits, at stripping away every trace of hope and dignity, until only obedience remained. They would make gladiators fight each other during training, turning men who might have been allies into enemies. They would promise rewards that never materialized, threaten punishments that always did. One of the most effective tools of psychological control was the use of the arena records. Painted on one wall of the courtyard was a list of every gladiator who had graduated from the school to fight in the arena. Next to each name was a number indicating how many fights they had survived. The list was hundreds of names long, stretching back decades, and the pattern was always the same. Most names had a 1 next to them, meaning they had died in their first fight. A few had 2 or 3. Only a handful had numbers in the double digit. At the very top of the list, painted in gold letters that caught the morning sun, was the name Commodus, with the number 47 beside it. Gaius would point to this name whenever a gladiator showed signs of hope or defiance. "Commodus," he would say, his voice dripping with mock reverence. "The greatest gladiator this school ever produced. 47 victories in the arena. Do you know what happened to him?" He would pause, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. "He got old, he got slow, and on his 48th fight, a boy half his age opened his throat with a lucky thrust, died choking on his own blood while 50,000 Romans cheered." The message was clear. Even success was temporary. Even victory was meaningless. Death was the only certainty, the only promise that would be kept. Midday brought weapons training, with real steel. And this was where the gladiators learned that their trainers were not interested in their survival. The weapons were sharp, the techniques were deadly, and accidents were frequent. A slip of the wrist, a momentary loss of concentration, a stumble at the wrong moment. Any of these could result in serious injury or death. Marcus watched a young Gallic warrior named Brennus take a practice thrust through the thigh during a sparring session. The blade had been aimed at his shield, But Brennus had moved at the wrong moment, and the point had found flesh instead of wood. Blood poured from the wound, soaking his tunic and pooling on the sand at his feet. The trainers showed no concern, no urgency to stop the bleeding. They simply dragged him to one side and told the other gladiators to continue their practice around his writhing form. In the arena, Gaius announced to the assembled men, "There are no accidents. There are only winners and losers, the living and the dead. If you cannot avoid a simple training thrust, how do you expect to survive when your opponent is trying to kill you for the entertainment of the mob?" Brennus bled to death over the course of the afternoon, his cries growing weaker and weaker until they finally stopped altogether. His body was removed that evening, dragged away by slaves like a piece of refuse. The next morning, a new recruit took his place, and training continued as if nothing had happened. The afternoon sessions focused on physical conditioning and specialized techniques. Gladiators ran laps around the courtyard, carrying heavy stones, their feet pounding against the packed earth until blisters formed and burst and formed again. They climbed ropes hung from wooden beams, their hands raw and bleeding from the rough hemp. They practiced rolling and dodging, essential skills for avoiding the nets of retieri or the charges of heavily armored opponents. But perhaps the most brutal part of the training was the mock combats, where gladiators were forced to fight each other with real weapons, while the trainers watched and evaluated their performance. These weren't practice sessions. They were blood sports designed to weed out the weak and identify those with the killer instinct necessary to survive in the arena. Marcus's first mock combat was against a Syrian archer named Demetrius, who had been designated as a hoplomachus, a gladiator who fought with a spear and small shield. The weapons were real, the danger was real, and the expectation was that one of them would be seriously injured or killed before the fight ended. The two men circled each other in the sand, sweat mixing with blood from numerous small cuts as they tested each other's defenses. Demetrius was quick and skilled with his spear, keeping Marcus at distance and looking for an opening to drive the point through his guard. Marcus's shield was heavy and unwieldy, but it was his only protection against the longer weapon. The fight lasted nearly an hour, both men becoming increasingly desperate as exhaustion set in. Finally, Marcus managed to get inside Demetrius's guard and drive his practiced sword into the Syrian's shoulder. The blade penetrated deeply, scraping against bone and sending a spray of blood across the sand. Demetrius dropped his spear and fell to his knees, clutching the wound and gasping in pain. "Finish him," Gaius commanded. Marcus hesitated. In the arena, this would be the moment when the crowd would decide whether the defeated gladiator lived or died. But this was training, not entertainment. This was a man he had shared meals with, slept near, suffered alongside. "I said finish him." Gaius's staff struck Marcus across the back, driving him forward. In the arena, hesitation is death. Your mercy will not be returned. Marcus raised his sword, looking down at Demetrius, who met his eyes with a mixture of pain and resignation. The Syrian nodded slightly, giving his permission for what was about to happen. Marcus closed his eyes and drove the blade home. That night, as he lay on his straw mattress listening to Klaus's labored breathing beside him, Marcus understood that he was no longer the man who had walked through the gates of the gladiator school. That man had been a farmer, a husband, a father. This new creature was something else entirely, a killer being shaped and molded for the entertainment of the mob. The training continued, day after day, week after week, each session more brutal than the last. Men died during practice, were crippled during sparring, or simply disappeared in the night when their minds finally snapped under the pressure. New recruits arrived regularly to replace them, fresh meat for the grinder that never stopped turning. And through it all, the arena waited. Marcus could see its massive walls rising above the rooftops of Rome when he climbed to the highest point of the gladiator school. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could hear the roar of the crowd. The sound of 50,000 voices raised in bloodlust and excitement. Soon, very soon, he would be down there in the sand fighting for his life while they cheered for his death. The training was preparing him for that moment, teaching him how to kill efficiently and die entertainingly. But nothing, no amount of preparation or practice, could ready a man for the reality of the arena. Because in the arena, death wasn't just a possibility, it was a performance, and the show had to go on. The amphitheater was a machine designed for death, and every component of that machine had been carefully calibrated to maximize both carnage and spectacle. As Marcus learned during his months of training, being a gladiator wasn't simply about fighting, it was about dying in very specific ways that would satisfy the bloodlust of the Roman mob. Each type of gladiator had their own role to play in this theater of death, their own costume to wear, their own method of killing and being killed. The secutor, Marcus's designated role, was perhaps the most straightforward of the gladiator types. But that simplicity made it no less deadly. Armed with a gladius and a large rectangular shield called a scotum, the secutor was designed to be the hunter in the classic matchup against the retiarius, or net fighter. The secutor's helmet was his most distinctive feature, a smooth, egg-shaped piece of bronze that covered his entire head except for 2 small eye holes and a few breathing slots around the mouth. It was designed to prevent a net from catching on any protruding elements, but it also severely limited vision and made breathing difficult during combat. Marcus had spent countless hours training in that helmet, learning to fight while seeing the world through 2 narrow slits and gasping for air through metal grating. The psychological effect was immediate and terrifying. It was like being buried alive while expected to fight for your life. The helmet amplified every sound. His own labored breathing became a roar in his ears. The clash of weapons was deafening, and the screams of dying men seemed to come from inside his own skull. The retiarius, the secutor's traditional opponent, represented the opposite approach to arena combat. Where the secutor was heavily armored and methodical, the retiarius was lightly protected and relied on speed and cunning. Armed with a trident, a weighted net, and a small dagger, the retiarius wore only a simple tunic and a metal shoulder guard on his left arm. His strategy was to entangle his opponent in the net, then finish him with the trident while he struggled helplessly. Marcus had faced many retiari during training, and he had learned to fear them more than any other gladiator type. Their net was 15 feet across and weighted with lead balls around the perimeter. When thrown properly, it spread out like a spider's web, and once it settled over a man, escape was nearly impossible. The more you struggled, the more entangled you became. And while you fought against the net, the retiarius would be circling you with his trident, looking for the perfect spot to drive those 3 bronze points through your body. But perhaps the most terrifying thing about fighting a retiarius was the crowd's reaction. The Romans loved the net fighter because he represented cunning over strength, skill over brute force. When a retiarius successfully netted his opponent, the crowd would roar with delight, screaming for him to take his time with the kill, to make it last, to make it entertaining. Marcus had seen training fights where netted gladiators were tortured for 10 minutes or more before the final thrust came, the retiarius drawing out their agony to please the spectators. The Thrax or Thracian gladiator fought with weapons modeled after those used by Rome's enemies in the Balkans. They carried a small rectangular shield called a parmula and a curved sword called a psycha, which was designed for slashing rather than thrusting. Their armor included elaborate shen guards and a distinctive helmet with a wide brim and a tall crest that often featured feathers or horsehair plumes. The Thrax was often matched against the Murmillo, creating a fight that represented Rome's victories over barbarian tribes. The murmillo was essentially a gladiator version of a Roman legionnaire, carrying equipment similar to what the army used but modified for arena combat. They fought with a gladius and a large shield, and their helmet featured a fish-shaped crest that gave them their name. The Murmillo versus Thrax matchup was one of the most popular combinations in the arena because it allowed the crowd to watch Romans defeat barbarians over and over again, reinforcing the empire's sense of superiority over its conquered enemies. The hoplomachus was modeled after Greek warriors and fought with a spear, a small round shield, and a dagger for close combat. Their armor included elaborate leg guards and a helmet with a distinctive circular crest. They were often matched against the Thrax or the Murmillo, and their fights tended to be longer and more technical than other combinations, because the spear gave them the ability to keep their opponents at distance. But not all arena combat involved traditional gladiator matchups. The Romans had developed dozens of variations and specialty acts designed to keep the crowds entertained and coming back for more. Some of the most horrifying spectacles involved the bestiarii, men who fought against wild animals rather than other gladiators. The bestiarii occupied the lowest rung of the gladiator hierarchy. Many were criminals who had been sentenced to death but given a theoretical chance at survival by facing wild beasts in the arena. They were given minimal training and basic weapons, usually just a spear or a club, and then thrown into the arena with lions, tigers, bears, or other predators that had been deliberately starved to make them more aggressive. The animal hunts, called venationes, were elaborate productions that transformed the arena floor into a miniature wilderness. Elaborate stage sets were constructed to represent forests, deserts, or exotic landscapes, complete with artificial trees, rocks, and water features. Trapdoors and mechanical lifts allowed animals to appear suddenly from beneath the arena floor, creating an element of surprise and terror that the crowds loved. Marcus had been forced to watch several venationes during his training, ostensibly to learn about arena procedures, but really to drive home the point that his situation could always get worse. He watched in horror as a man was thrown into the arena with a starving lion, armed with nothing but a wooden club. The beast was on him in seconds, its massive claws raking across his chest and opening wounds that sprayed blood across the sand. The man's screams were audible even above the roar of the crowd, but they didn't last long. The lion crushed his skull with a single bite, then began feeding while he was still alive. But even more disturbing than the animal hunts were the mass executions disguised as entertainment. During the midday break between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiator fights, condemned criminals were brought into the arena for public execution. These weren't fights. They were elaborate forms of capital punishment designed to terrorize the population while entertaining the mob. Some criminals were crucified in the arena, nailed to crosses, and left to die slowly, while the crowd ate lunch and discussed the morning's events. Others were burned alive, tied to posts and surrounded by oil-soaked wood that was ignited while they screamed for mercy that would never come. Still others were torn apart by wild animals, thrown naked and defenseless into pits filled with hungry beasts. One of the most popular forms of execution entertainment was the naxia of fights, where condemned criminals were forced to fight each other to the death with real weapons, but no training. The last man standing would technically win, but his prize was usually just a different, equally horrific form of execution. Marcus watched one such event where 30 men were thrown into the arena and told that only one could leave alive. What followed was a chaotic slaughter where desperation drove men to unimaginable acts of violence. Brothers killed brothers, fathers murdered sons, and friends betrayed friends in the mad scramble to survive just a few minutes longer. The crowd loved these spectacles because they reinforced Roman values while simultaneously allowing them to indulge their darkest impulses. Justice was being served, order was being maintained, and the empire's enemies were being punished. But underneath that veneer of righteousness was pure bloodlust, a hunger for violence and death that seemed to grow stronger with each feeding. Even within the traditional gladiator fights, there were variations designed to maximize entertainment value. Handicap matches pitted one skilled fighter against multiple opponents, creating a David versus Goliath scenario that could go either way. Blind gladiator fights involved men with their helmets' eye slits covered, forcing them to fight by sound alone while the crowd laughed at their confusion and mistakes. Group battles, called pugna, could involve dozens of gladiators fighting simultaneously in a massive melee that continued until only a few survivors remained. These events were particularly brutal because alliances formed and dissolved rapidly, and men who had fought together as allies in the morning might find themselves trying to kill each other by afternoon. Naval battles, or nomichii, were the most elaborate and expensive spectacles of all. The arena floor would be flooded with water, and gladiators would fight from specially constructed ships, trying to ram, board, and sink their opponents' vessels, while engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The logistics of these events were staggering. Thousands of tons of water had to be pumped into the arena. The drainage systems had to be modified, and the wooden floor had to be waterproofed. But the result was a spectacle unlike anything else in the ancient world, combining naval warfare with gladiatorial combat in a way that left audiences breathless. The Romans also staged historical recreations, forcing gladiators to reenact famous battles from the empire's past. These events were propaganda as much as entertainment, reinforcing the narrative of Roman superiority. While providing spectacular violence, gladiators would be divided into Roman and barbarian forces, with the outcome predetermined to ensure that Rome always won, even if the individual participants on the Roman side were actually slaves and criminals. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of arena combat was the randomness of the assignments. A gladiator never knew what type of fight he would face until the day of the games. He might train for months as a secutor, perfecting his techniques against retiari, only to be thrown into the arena against a pack of wild dogs or forced to fight blindfolded against an opponent he couldn't see. This uncertainty was deliberately cultivated by the arena organizers because it prevented gladiators from becoming too comfortable or confident. A man who knew exactly what he would face could prepare mentally and physically for that specific challenge. But a man who might face anything, a trained opponent, a wild animal, a group of criminals, or an execution disguised as entertainment, remained in a constant state of terror and desperation. The weapons themselves were another source of psychological torture. Gladiators trained with specific weapons designed for their fighting style. But in the arena, they might be given different equipment entirely. A retiarius might find himself with a sword and shield. A secutor might be handed a trident and net, or both men might be given weapons they had never used before, and told to figure it out while trying to kill each other. The crowd's reaction to these mismatches was always enthusiastic. They loved watching skilled fighters struggle with unfamiliar equipment, laughed when weapons broke or failed, and cheered when desperation drove men to improvise deadly new techniques on the spot. The suffering of the gladiators was the entire point of the exercise. Medical attention in the arena was primitive at best and deliberately inadequate. There were doctors present during the games, but their job wasn't to save lives. It was to determine whether wounded gladiators were actually dead or just pretending in order to escape further combat. They would test for responsiveness by pressing hot irons against the skin or stabbing suspected corpses with sharp instruments. If a man moved or cried out, he was dragged back into the fight until he was genuinely dead. The arena floor itself was designed to facilitate carnage. The sand wasn't just for footing, it was there to absorb blood and make cleanup easier between events. Different colors of sand were used to create patterns and designs that would show blood stains more dramatically. And fresh sand was spread over the worst gore between fights to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. Underneath the arena floor was a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices that allowed for elaborate special effects. Animals could be lifted into the arena through trapdoors, weapons could be lowered from above, and even entire stage sets could be raised or lowered to transform the fighting space between events. This infrastructure required hundreds of workers and represented a massive investment in the technology of death. The gladiators, waiting their turn in the holding chambers beneath the arena, could hear everything happening above: the roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men. They knew that their own turn was coming, and the waiting was almost worse than the fighting itself. Some men broke down completely during these waiting periods, sobbing uncontrollably or begging the guards to just kill them quickly, rather than making them face the arena. But the guards showed no mercy. Their job was to ensure that every gladiator entered the arena in fighting condition, whether he wanted to or not. Men who refused to fight were beaten until they changed their minds, drugged to make them more aggressive, or simply pushed into the arena at spear point and left to face their fate. The arena was more than just a place of entertainment. It was a machine designed to process human beings into spectacle, to transform living, breathing, thinking people into blood and sand and memories. Every aspect of the system, from the specialized weapons to the elaborate stage effects, was calibrated to maximize both the quantity and quality of death, while ensuring that the audience remained entertained and engaged. And at the center of it all were the gladiators themselves. Men who had once been farmers, soldiers, slaves, or criminals, now reduced to nothing more than performers, soldiers, slaves, or criminals. Now reduced to nothing more than performers in history's most brutal theater. They fought not for glory or honor, but simply for the chance to live one more day, to postpone their inevitable appointment with death for just a little while longer. The night before his first arena appearance, Marcus lay on his straw mattress listening to the sounds of the city beyond the gladiator school walls. Rome never truly slept, but in the pre-dawn hours, the usual cacophony of voices, cartwheels and construction noise faded to a distant murmur punctuated by the occasional cry of a night watchman or the howl of a stray dog. In just a few hours, he would walk through the gates of the Colosseum, and there was a very real possibility that he would never walk out again. Sleep was impossible. Every time Marcus closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men he had killed during training, heard their final gasps, felt the resistance of flesh and bone against his blade. Demetrius, the Syrian hoplomachus, had been only the first. Over the months of preparation, there had been others, men who had fallen during practice fights, sparring sessions that had gone too far, mock combats, where the line between training and murder had been deliberately blurred by instructors who wanted their gladiators to develop a taste for killing. Beside him, Klaus was equally restless, his massive frame shifting constantly on the narrow sleeping space they shared. The Germanic warrior had been scheduled for the same games, assigned to fight as a Threx against an experienced Murmillo, who had already survived 8 arena encounters. Klaus spoke little Latin, but Marcus had learned enough Germanic words over their months together to understand the prayers the big man was whispering into the darkness. Appeals to gods whose names sounded like thunder and wind, desperate bargains offered in exchange for just one more sunrise. The pre-arena ritual began before dawn with what the guards mockingly called the Last Supper, though it bore no resemblance to any meal that free men would recognize. The gladiators assigned to fight that day were separated from the rest and brought to a special dining chamber where they were served the best food available in the ludus, which still amounted to barely edible scraps compared to what ordinary Romans consumed daily. The bread was fresher than usual, only 3 days old instead of a week. The porridge had actual pieces of meat floating in it, though the chunks were gristly and tough enough to break teeth. There was even watered wine, a luxury that regular trainees never saw, but the improved quality of the meal only served to emphasize its purpose. These men were being fattened for slaughter. given enough strength to put on a good show before they died. Marcus found that he couldn't eat. His stomach churned with nervous energy, and every bite tasted like ash in his mouth. Around the table, other gladiators were having similar reactions. Some gorged themselves desperately, as if this might be their final opportunity to experience pleasure of any kind. Others, like Marcus, could barely choke down a few mouthfuls. A few sat staring at their bowls without touching them at all, already lost in the contemplation of their approaching death. The conversation was muted and fragmented. Men spoke in low voices about their families, their homes, their regrets. A Gallic warrior named Brennus told anyone who would listen about his wife and 3 children, describing their faces in obsessive detail as if the words could somehow conjure them into the dining chamber. A former Roman soldier called Lucius, convicted of desertion and sentenced to the arena, recited poetry in a voice that grew progressively more unsteady with each stanza. But not everyone was resigned to death. Titus, a veteran retiarius, who had somehow survived 4 previous arena appearances, moved among the first-time fighters, offering advice and encouragement. His body was a map of near-fatal wounds, a long scar across his ribs, where a secutor's blade had nearly opened his chest, a mangled left hand missing 2 fingers from a tiger's bite, and a network of smaller marks that spoke of countless close encounters with death. The secret, Titus told Marcus, is to never forget that you're performing. The crowd wants a show, not just a quick kill. Give them drama, give them suspense, and they might just let you live when your opponent falls. He leaned closer, his breath heavy with wine and the smell of old wounds. But remember, mercy from the mob is rarer than gold. They'd rather see you die bravely than live as a coward. After the meal came the most psychologically devastating part of the pre-arena ritual, the weapons selection. The gladiators were led to an armory where their equipment for the day's fights was laid out on wooden tables like instruments of worship in some dark temple. But these weren't the heavy training weapons they had become accustomed to. These were the real implements of death, sharp enough to cut through bone, perfectly balanced for killing. Marcus's assigned gear, as a secutor, included a gladius with an edge so keen it could slice through a hair held in the air, a rectangular scutum made of layered wood and leather that was both lighter and stronger than his training shield, and the dreaded helmet that would transform him from a human being into an anonymous killing machine. The helmet was a work of terrible artistry, its bronze surface polished to a mirror shine and decorated with intricate engravings that caught the torchlight like liquid fire. But it was the weight of the real weapons that struck him most forcefully. After months of training with equipment deliberately made heavier than necessary, the actual gladius felt impossibly light in his hand, almost floating. He could move it faster than thought, and the razor-sharp edge whispered through the air with a sound like silk being torn. This was a weapon designed for one purpose only: to end human life as efficiently as possible. The armor fitting was conducted by specialists who had spent years learning exactly how gladiatorial equipment should sit on a man's body. Every strap had to be precisely adjusted, every piece of metal positioned to provide maximum protection without limiting mobility. These men knew that their work might mean the difference between a gladiator's life and death, but they showed no emotion as they went about their task. To them, the gladiators were just mannequins to be dressed for a performance. As Marcus submitted to the fitting process, he caught sight of himself in a polished bronze mirror hanging on the armory wall. The reflection that stared back at him was barely recognizable as the farmer who had walked into the gladiator school months earlier. His body had been transformed by endless training into something lean and dangerous, all excess flesh burned away to reveal the raw machinery of violence beneath. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso, marking him as someone who had learned to survive by dealing death to others. But it was his eyes that disturbed him most. They looked hollow, empty of everything that had once made him human. The capacity for mercy, for love, for hope. All of it had been systematically stripped away until only the killer remained. He was no longer Marcus the farmer, Marcus the husband, Marcus the father. He was simply Gladiator 47, a piece of equipment to be used up and discarded for the entertainment of the mob. The psychological preparation continued with a ritual that the gladiators called the blessing, though it bore little resemblance to any religious ceremony that free men would recognize. A priest of Mars, the god of war, moved among the fighters with a bronze bowl filled with what he claimed was sacred water. In reality, it was probably just ordinary water mixed with wine and perhaps a few drops of blood from previous sacrifices. But the symbolism was important. Each gladiator knelt before the priest and received a few drops of the liquid on his forehead while the priest muttered prayers in archaic Latin that few of them could understand. The blessing was supposed to ensure that the gods would look favorably upon their performance in the arena, that their deaths would be glorious and their spirits would find peace in the afterlife. But Marcus suspected that the real purpose was to provide one final reminder that they were about to die, that their fate was sealed and their only choice was how entertainingly they could meet their end. Some gladiators found genuine comfort in the ritual, crossing themselves and mumbling their own prayers to whatever gods they still believed in. Others went through the motions with obvious skepticism, understanding that the blessing was just another part of the theater that surrounded their approaching death. A few refused to participate at all, earning themselves beatings from the guards but maintaining some small shred of dignity in the face of the systematic dehumanization they had endured. As the morning progressed, the gladiators could hear the crowds beginning to gather outside the Colosseum. The sound started as a distant murmur like the buzzing of insects, but gradually grew louder and more distinct as more people arrived. Voices shouted greetings to friends, vendors hawked food and souvenirs, and children laughed with excitement at the prospect of seeing men die for their entertainment. The noise was psychologically devastating for the waiting gladiators. They could hear their audience arriving, could sense the anticipation building, could almost feel the weight of 50,000 pairs of eyes that would soon be focused on their struggle for survival. Some men began to pace frantically in their holding cells. Others sat in perfect stillness as if they had already died. And a few broke down completely, sobbing or screaming until the guards silenced them with clubs or drugs. Marcus found himself thinking about his family for the first time in months. During training, he had deliberately suppressed all memories of his wife and children, understanding instinctively that such thoughts would only weaken his resolve and make the brutal reality of his situation even harder to bear. But now, facing the possibility of imminent death, their faces came flooding back with painful clarity. His wife, Anna, had been pregnant when he left for the gladiator school. By now, she would have given birth to their third child, a son or daughter he would never see. His other children, Marcus the younger, and little Claudia, would be growing up without a father, probably believing that he had abandoned them rather than died trying to provide for them. The knowledge that his sacrifice had been meaningless, that his family would receive nothing from his death except grief and poverty, was almost more than he could bear. But such thoughts were a luxury he could no longer afford. The sound of hobnailed boots on stone announced the arrival of the guards who would escort them to the arena. They came with chains and clubs, not because they expected resistance, but because the chains were part of the spectacle. The crowd wanted to see condemned men being led to their death, wanted to witness the moment when hope finally died in their eyes. The procession from the gladiator school to the Colosseum was a parade of the damned. The gladiators were chained together in a long line, their weapons carried separately by guards to prevent any last-minute attempts at escape or rebellion. The streets were lined with spectators who had arrived early to secure the best seats, and they jeered and threw refuse at the passing fighters, treating them like condemned criminals rather than the skilled warriors they actually were. Some spectators placed bets on which gladiators would survive the day, shouting odds and arguing about the relative merits of different fighting styles. Others simply came to gawk at men who were about to die, studying their faces for signs of fear or desperation, like physicians examining patients with interesting diseases. Children pointed and laughed, having been taught that gladiators were something less than human, objects of entertainment rather than people with families and dreams and fears. The Colosseum itself was a monument to Rome's engineering genius and its moral depravity. The massive elliptical structure rose from the heart of the city like a stone mountain, its multiple tiers of arches and columns creating a facade that was both beautiful and terrifying. 50,000 people could fit inside its walls, and when full, their collective voice could be heard for miles in every direction. As the gladiators approached the arena's massive gates, the noise from within became overwhelming. The crowd was already in full voice, cheering for the morning's animal hunts and executions, warming up for the main event of gladiatorial combat. The sound was like standing next to a waterfall or inside a thunderstorm, a constant roar that seemed to penetrate every cell of Marcus's body and remind him that he was about to become the focus of more concentrated attention than any human being was ever meant to endure. The holding area beneath the arena was a maze of corridors, cells, and mechanical devices that would have impressed engineers from any era. Elaborate pulley systems could lift animals or stage props up through trapdoors in the arena floor. Complex water channels allowed the entire space to be flooded for naval battles. Storage rooms held thousands of weapons, costumes, and pieces of scenery needed to create the elaborate spectacles that Roman audiences demanded. But for the gladiators, the underground area was simply a waiting room for death. They were separated into individual cells, barely large enough for a man to stand upright, with iron bars that allowed them to see the corridor, but provided no privacy or dignity. Guards patrolled constantly, not to prevent escape, which was impossible, but to ensure that no gladiator injured himself or committed suicide before his scheduled fight. The waiting was perhaps the cruelest part of the entire ordeal. Hours could pass between the time a gladiator arrived at the Colosseum and the moment he was called to fight. During that time, he could hear everything happening above: the roar of the crowd, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying men and animals. He knew that his own death was approaching, minute by minute, but he had no control over when it would come or how it would unfold. Some gladiators spent their final hours in prayer, appealing to gods who seemed to have abandoned them long ago. Others wrote farewell messages on the walls of their cells, scratching letters into the stone with broken pieces of pottery or metal. Many simply sat in silence, conserving their strength for the fight to come, and trying not to think about the fact that they would probably never see another sunset. Marcus found himself remembering a conversation he had had with his father years earlier when he was still a child. The old man had told him that death was not the enemy. Meaninglessness was. A man can face anything, his father had said, as long as he knows that his life and death serve some purpose greater than himself. But sitting in that stone cell, listening to the baying of the crowd above, Marcus could find no meaning in what was about to happen to him. He would die for the entertainment of people who didn't know his name, who would forget him before his blood had time to dry in the sand. The call, when it finally came, was almost a relief. A guard appeared at his cell door and shouted his number, not his name, because names were irrelevant here. He was led through a series of corridors toward the arena floor, his legs feeling strangely weak after hours of sitting in the cramped cell. Other gladiators were being moved at the same time, all of them converging on the same destination like streams flowing toward a waterfall. And then, suddenly, they were there. the massive wooden doors swung open, and Marcus found himself standing at the entrance to the arena proper. Squinting against the sudden brightness of direct sunlight and the reflected glare from 50,000 white togas, the noise was indescribable. Not just loud, but physically oppressive, like being trapped inside a breaking wave. The arena floor stretched before him, covered in fresh sand that had been raked into patterns and designs. In the center of the space, slaves were dragging away the body of a gladiator who had died in the previous fight, leaving a dark stain in the sand that would soon be covered by Marcus's own blood. Around the perimeter, the crowd rose tier upon tier toward the sky, a solid wall of faces all focused on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. This was it, the moment that months of training had been leading toward. In a few minutes, he would be handed weapons and told to fight for his life, while 50,000 Romans cheered for his death. There would be no mercy, no reprieve, no escape, only sand and blood, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, he might live to see another day. The gates swung shut behind him, with a sound like the closing of a tomb. The moment Marcus stepped onto the arena floor, the sound of the crowd hit him like a physical blow. 50,000 voices merged into a single roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating through the soles of his feet and into his bones. The noise was not merely loud, it was alive. A beast with its own hunger and its own terrible intelligence, and that beast wanted blood. The sand beneath his feet was soft and fine, imported from the beaches of Egypt, at enormous expense because it absorbed blood better than the coarse local variety. It had been raked into intricate patterns by slaves who worked through the night to prepare the arena for each day's entertainment. But Marcus barely noticed the artistry beneath his feet. His attention was focused entirely on staying alive for the next few minutes. The procession of gladiators moved slowly around the perimeter of the arena, giving the crowd time to study each fighter and place their final bets. Marcus could see faces in the lower tiers clearly enough to make out individual expressions. The eager anticipation of young men who had never seen violent death, the jaded boredom of veterans who had attended hundreds of these spectacles, the bloodthirsty excitement of women who screamed for carnage with voices made hoarse by previous entertainments. In the imperial box, elevated above the common spectators and shaded by purple silk awnings, sat the man who would decide whether Marcus lived or died today. Emperor Domitian had a reputation for being particularly fond of gladiatorial games, often staying from dawn until dusk to watch every fight personally. He was a small, soft-looking man with thinning hair and the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, but the purple stripe on his toga and the gold circlet on his head marked him as the most powerful human being on earth. The Emperor's power over life and death in the arena was absolute. When a gladiator fell and could no longer fight, the crowd would express their opinion about his fate through gestures and shouts. But the final decision always rested with the man in the purple toga. A turned thumb could mean death. A closed fist might indicate mercy, but mercy was rare, and Marcus had been told repeatedly during training that he should expect none. The gladiators completed their circuit of the arena and came to a halt before the imperial box. In unison, they raised their weapons and shouted the traditional salute, Avev Imperator, Morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor. Those who are about to die salute you. The words echoed off the arena walls, and for a moment the crowd fell silent, as if acknowledging the gravity of what was about to unfold. But the silence lasted only seconds before the noise resumed with renewed intensity. The spectators began chanting the names of their favorite gladiators, placing last-minute wagers and demanding that the entertainment begin. They had not come to the Colosseum to reflect on mortality or the value of human life. They had come to see men die, and they were growing impatient. Marcus was led to a holding area at the edge of the arena floor where gladiators waited for their individual matches to be called. From here, he could see everything that happened in the sand. And what he saw filled him with a terror deeper than anything he had experienced during training. The reality of arena combat was far more brutal and chaotic than any practice session could have prepared him for. The first fight of the afternoon featured two retiari against a single murmillo, a handicap match designed to test whether skill and experience could overcome numerical disadvantage. The murmillo was a veteran named Gaius Brutus who had survived 14 previous arena appearances, making him something of a legend among gladiators. His opponents were younger men, fast and eager but lacking the cold efficiency that came only from years of killing for entertainment. The fight began with the traditional ritual. The combatants saluted the emperor, received their final instructions from the arena officials, and took their positions in the center of the sand. Then, at a signal from a horn, they began trying to murder each other, while 50,000 people cheered. The retiari spread out immediately, trying to use their numerical advantage to attack from different angles while avoiding the murmillo's powerful thrusts. Their nets flashed in the sunlight as they sought openings, the lead weights on the perimeters whistling through the air with deadly intent. But Gaius Brutus had faced this situation before, and his movements were economical and precise, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes or dramatic gestures. The veteran gladiator positioned himself with his back to the arena wall, preventing the retiari from getting behind him while forcing them to approach from the front where his shield and sword could protect him most effectively. When the younger fighters tried to coordinate their attacks, he would suddenly charge one of them, forcing him to retreat while disrupting their timing and teamwork. The crowd was on its feet, screaming advice and encouragement to all three fighters while betting odds shifted constantly based on each moment's action. Marcus could see bookmakers in the stands frantically updating their tablets as the fight progressed, and he realized that his own impending death was probably the subject of similar calculations. To these people, he was not a human being with hopes and fears and people who loved him. He was simply a commodity whose value fluctuated based on his perceived chances of providing entertaining violence. The first retiarius made his mistake after about 10 minutes of careful maneuvering. He threw his net too eagerly, aiming for Gaius Brutus's feet but missing by inches when the veteran jumped backward at the last second. The net hit the sand and began to tangle, and in the seconds it took the retiarius to recover it, Gaius Brutus closed the distance between them with the speed of a striking snake. The gladius went in, just below the ribs and angled upward toward the heart. It was a perfect killing thrust, delivered with the precision that came only from years of practice and hundreds of previous victims. The retiarius's mouth opened in surprise, blood spilling over his lips as he tried to scream, but could only produce a wet, gurgling sound. His trident fell from nerveless fingers and he collapsed onto the sand, his body twitching as his life ebbed away. The crowd roared its approval, but the second retiarius was already in motion, his own net flying toward Gaius Brutus, while the veteran was still extracting his sword from his opponent's body. The weighted mesh settled over the murmillo's shoulders and began to tighten, but the experienced gladiator didn't panic. Instead of struggling against the net, he dropped to one knee and rolled forward, using his momentum to entangle his opponent's trident while simultaneously pulling the retiarius off balance. What followed was a desperate wrestling match in the sand, both men fighting for control of weapons while the net wrapped around them like a cocoon. The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch as the combatants rolled and struggled, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Blood from various cuts began to stain the sand around them, and Marcus could smell the metallic scent even from his position at the edge of the arena. Finally, Gaius Brutus managed to work his dagger free and drive it into his opponent's neck, severing the major blood vessels with a single precise cut. The retiarius convulsed once and then went limp, his blood pumping out onto the sand in rhythmic spurts that gradually slowed and stopped The veteran gladiator stood up slowly, untangling himself from the net, while the crowd cheered his victory. But even victory in the arena was tainted with horror. Gaius Brutus was bleeding from numerous wounds, and Marcus could see that one of his arms was hanging at an unnatural angle, probably broken during the wrestling match. The man had won his fight and earned the right to live another day, but at a cost that would make his next battle even more difficult to survive. Slaves rushed onto the arena floor to drag away the bodies and rake fresh sand over the bloodstains. The efficiency of this process was chilling. Within minutes, all evidence of the violence had been erased, and the arena looked pristine and ready for the next entertainment. It was as if the two men who had just died had never existed at all. Marcus watched this cleanup process with growing dread, understanding that his own death would be handled with the same casual efficiency. There would be no ceremony, no moment of silence, no acknowledgement that a human life had ended. He would simply be dragged away like refuse and dumped into a mass grave, with all the other gladiators who had died that day for the amusement of the mob. The fights continued throughout the afternoon, each one more brutal than the last. Marcus witnessed a Thrax being disemboweled by a Murmillo's thrust that opened his belly from hip to hip, spilling his intestines onto the sand while he screamed for death that was slow in coming. He saw Hoplomachus lose his footing on blood-slicked sand and fall onto his own spear, the point entering through his back and emerging from his chest in a spray of gore that painted the nearby arena wall. Between fights, the crowd was entertained by various novelty acts, designed to maintain their interest and bloodlust. Dwarfs fought each other with tiny weapons while the audience laughed at their struggles. Women gladiators, a rare but popular attraction, engaged in combat that was deliberately sexualized for the titillation of male spectators. Criminals were thrown to wild animals or forced to fight each other with ridiculous weapons like ladles or cooking pots. But perhaps the most disturbing spectacle was the execution of political prisoners, disguised as gladiatorial combat. These men were given real weapons and told to fight, but they had received no training and were clearly terrified beyond rational thought. Their struggles were pathetic rather than heroic, and the crowd's laughter at their ineptitude was the cruelest sound Marcus had ever heard. As the afternoon wore on and his own fight approached, Marcus felt his mind beginning to fragment under the stress. Part of him remained coldly analytical, studying the techniques of successful gladiators, and trying to identify strategies that might keep him alive for a few more minutes. But another part of his consciousness seemed to float above the arena, looking down with detached horror at the systematic slaughter taking place below. He found himself thinking about the philosophical discussions he had heard in the marketplace, back home, debates about the nature of civilization, and what separated Romans from the barbarians they conquered. Those discussions seemed laughably naive now. There was nothing civilized about what was happening in this arena. This was pure savagery, dressed up in elaborate costumes and justified by appeals to tradition and the will of the god. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western rim of the arena when Marcus's name was finally called. A guard appeared at his side and gestured toward the weapons rack where his equipment waited. The gladius felt impossibly light in his hand after months of training with heavier practice weapons, and the shield seemed to float on his arm like a feather. But the helmet, when he placed it over his head, transformed the world into a narrow tunnel of limited vision and labored breathing. His opponent was already waiting in the center of the arena. A retiarius named Aquarius, who had survived 3 previous fights. The man was lean and quick, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was still hungry for victory, rather than resigned to death. His net was coiled at his feet like a sleeping serpent, and his trident gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, as he tested its balance with quick, economical movements. The crowd's reaction to Marcus's appearance was mixed. Some spectators had placed money on him based on his reputation during training, but others saw him as an untested rookie who would provide only a brief moment of entertainment before dying. The betting odds favored Aquarius heavily, and Marcus could hear bookmakers in the stands updating their calculations as the two gladiators faced each other across the blood-stained sand. The traditional pre-fight ritual seemed to last forever. The gladiators saluted the emperor, received their final instructions from the arena officials, and tested their weapons one last time. Then they took their positions, separated by about 20 feet of sand that might as well have been the distance between life and death. The horn sounded, and the fight began. Aquarius came forward cautiously, his net held low and ready while his trident remained poised for either throwing or thrusting. Marcus kept his shield high and his sword ready, remembering the countless hours of training that had prepared him for this moment. But all the practice in the world could not have prepared him for the reality of facing a man who was genuinely trying to kill him while 50,000 people screamed for blood. The Retiarius fainted with his trident, testing Marcus's reactions and looking for patterns in his defense. Marcus responded by advancing slightly, trying to close the distance and negate his opponent's reach advantage. The crowd noise was deafening, but both fighters had learned to ignore distractions and focus entirely on the deadly dance they were performing. The first real exchange came when Aquarius threw his net in a sweeping arc aimed at Marcus's legs. The secutor jumped backward, feeling the weighted edge of the net brush against his shins as he narrowly avoided entanglement. But his retreat brought him dangerously close to the arena wall, limiting his options and giving his opponent a tactical advantage. Aquarius pressed his attack immediately, driving forward with his trident, while Marcus was still off balance from his jump. The 3 bronze points came within inches of penetrating the secutor's guard, and Marcus felt the wind from their passage against his neck as he twisted desperately to avoid being skewered. The fight settled into a deadly pattern of thrust and parry, advance and retreat, each man looking for the small mistake or moment of inattention that would allow him to land a killing blow. Marcus's superior armor gave him some protection, but it also slowed him down and limited his mobility. Aquarius's speed and reach were significant advantages, but he had to be constantly aware of his positioning to avoid being trapped against the arena wall. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours to the combatants. Both men were bleeding from minor cuts, and their movements were beginning to slow as exhaustion set in. The crowd's excitement was building to a crescendo, sensing that the decisive moment of the fight was approaching. It came when Aquarius overextended himself on a trident thrust, putting too much of his weight behind the attack in his eagerness to end the fight. Marcus deflected the weapon with his shield and stepped inside his opponent's reach, bringing his gladius up in a short, vicious thrust aimed at the Retiarius's exposed ribs. The blade slid between bones and into vital organs with the wet, tearing sound that Marcus had heard so many times during training. Aquarius's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and blood began to foam from his mouth as his punctured lung filled with fluid. He dropped his trident and clutched at the sword blade protruding from his chest, as if he could somehow pull it out and reverse what had happened to him. But death was already claiming him. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees in the sand, his life's blood spreading in a growing pool around his body. Marcus stood over him, breathing heavily through the narrow slits in his helmet, waiting for the crowd's verdict on his opponent's fate. The Emperor's box was the center of attention, as 50,000 people looked to Domitian for the final decision. The Emperor sat forward in his chair, studying the dying Retiarius with the detached interest of a physician examining an interesting case. Then, with casual indifference, he extended his hand and turned his thumb downward. Death. The crowd roared its approval as Marcus raised his sword for the final blow. Aquarius looked up at him through pain-glazed eyes, and for a moment their gazes met through the slits in the secutor's helmet. In that instant, Marcus saw not an enemy or an obstacle, but a man who had once been someone's son, someone's friend, someone's hope for the future. Then training took over, and the Gladius came down in a merciful stroke that ended Aquarius's suffering. The Retiarius shuddered once and was still, his blood seeping into the Egyptian sand, while the crowd cheered Marcus's victory. He had won. He had survived his first arena fight and earned the right to live another day. But as he stood over his opponent's body, listening to the deafening approval of the mob, Marcus understood that this victory was meaningless. Tomorrow or next week, or next month, he would be back in this same arena, facing another opponent, fighting for his life while Romans cheered for his death. The arena had claimed another victim, but it was not the man lying dead in the sand. It was the part of Marcus's soul that had once believed in mercy, justice, and the inherent value of human life. That man had died with Aquarius, leaving behind only a killer trained to provide entertainment for a bloodthirsty mob. As slaves rushed forward to drag away the body and rake fresh sand over the bloodstains, Marcus walked slowly toward the arena exit, his victory already forgotten by spectators who were eagerly anticipating the next fight. He had survived, but survival in the arena was not living. It was merely postponing death while gradually losing everything that made existence worthwhile. Victory in the arena was supposed to feel like triumph, but as Marcus stumbled through the exit tunnel, his legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, all he felt was a hollow emptiness that seemed to echo in his chest. Like a bell struck in an empty room, the cheers of the crowd faded behind him, replaced by the grimmer sounds of the arena's underbelly. The groans of wounded gladiators, the scrape of bodies being dragged across stone, and the constant drip of blood from wounds both fresh and festering. The victory had bought him perhaps a month of life. Maybe two, if he was fortunate enough to be scheduled for games during a period when the Emperor was distracted by other entertainments. But it had cost him something far more valuable than time. It had cost him the last fragments of his humanity. The moment his sword had slipped between Aquarius's ribs and found the soft organs beneath, Marcus had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He was no longer a farmer who had been forced to become a killer. He was simply a killer, nothing more. The medical station beneath the arena was a butcher shop disguised as a hospital. Gladiators who had survived their fights were brought here to be patched up enough to fight again, while those who were dying were left in corners to expire quietly without disturbing the more valuable fighters. The physicians were skilled in their way, having learned through necessity how to stop bleeding quickly and efficiently. But they showed no more compassion than veterinarians treating injured horses. Marcus was examined by a Greek doctor whose hands moved over his body with clinical detachment, probing for injuries that might affect his performance in future fights. The physician cleaned and dressed several minor cuts, checked his joints for damage, and pronounced him fit for combat within 10 days. No congratulations were offered for his victory. No recognition that he had just killed a man for the entertainment of the mob. He was simply another piece of equipment to be maintained until it broke. The other wounded gladiators in the medical area presented a catalog of the arena's casual cruelty. A thrax named Lucius sat on a wooden stool while a physician attempted to reattach tendons in his sword arm that had been severed by a murmula's blade. The man's face was gray with pain and blood loss, but he endured the primitive surgery without anesthesia because screaming would have marked him as weak and unsuitable for future fights. Nearby, a Retiarius called Antonius lay on a blood-soaked table while a doctor attempted to stuff his intestines back into his abdomen after a secutor's thrust had opened his belly. The wounded man was conscious and aware, watching his own internal organs being manipulated by hands that showed no more care than a cook preparing a meal. His survival was unlikely, but the physicians would try to save him anyway because trained gladiators represented significant financial investments. But perhaps the most disturbing sight was that of the gladiators who had won their fights but suffered injuries that would affect their future performance. These men faced a cruel paradox. They had survived, but their wounds made them less likely to survive the next time. In the arena, weakness was a death sentence that might be delayed but never avoided. Marcus watched a veteran Murmillo named Gaius examine his own reflection in a polished bronze mirror. Studying the fresh scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw where an opponent's blade had nearly split his skull. The wound had healed poorly, leaving the man's face twisted into a permanent grimace that would make it difficult for him to see attacks coming from his blind side. He knew, and everyone else knew, that his next fight would likely be his last. The gladiator barracks at night were a place of whispered conversations and suppressed despair. Men who had spent the day trying to kill each other now lay side by side on their straw mattresses, united by their shared understanding that death was not a possibility, but an inevitability. Some sought comfort in each other's company, forming friendships that were doomed to end in the sand of the arena. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming increasingly isolated as they tried to protect their hearts from the pain of watching friends die. Marcus found himself somewhere in between, maintaining polite relationships with his fellow gladiators, but refusing to allow anyone to get close enough to truly hurt him when they inevitably died. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to shut off the parts of his mind that insisted on treating other people as human beings rather than temporary obstacles or allies. The veteran gladiators spoke in hushed tones about the psychology of survival, sharing hard-won wisdom about how to endure the mental torture of arena life. Some advocated complete emotional detachment, treating every fight as a simple problem to be solved rather than a life-or-death struggle. Others recommended focusing on hatred for the crowd, using rage as fuel to drive them through the physical and psychological demands of combat. But the most chilling advice came from those who had survived the longest, men like Commodus, who had won more than 40 fights, and achieved a kind of legendary status among both gladiators and spectators. These veterans spoke of a state of mind that transcended normal human emotion, a place where killing became as natural and unconscious as breathing. They described fights where they felt nothing at all, moving through the motions of combat like sleepwalkers who happened to be holding deadly weapons. The secret, Commodus told Marcus one night, as they sat in the darkness of the barracks, is to stop thinking of yourself as human. Humans feel fear, guilt, compassion, all emotions that will get you killed in the arena. You must become something else, something that exists only to fight and win and survive until the next fight. The old gladiator's voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotional inflection that might have suggested he still possessed a soul. He spoke of murder with the same tone another man might use to discuss the weather, and his eyes reflected nothing but emptiness when the torchlight caught them. I stopped feeling anything during my 15th fight, Commodus continued. I was facing a Rotarius who reminded me of my brother. Same build, same way of moving, same expression of desperate hope when he realized he was about to die. And suddenly I understood that if I allowed myself to see him as human, I would hesitate at the crucial moment and die myself. So I chose to stop seeing anyone as human, including myself. Marcus found this advice deeply disturbing, but he could not deny its practical value. The gladiators who survived longest were indeed those who seemed to have transcended normal human emotion, becoming killing machines that operated with mechanical efficiency. They won their fights not through superior skill or strength, but through their complete willingness to do whatever was necessary to continue living, no matter how many others had to die in the process. But survival in the arena came with costs that extended far beyond the physical injuries accumulated during combat. The gladiators who lived longest were also those who seemed least alive in any meaningful sense. They moved through their daily routines like men who had already died but whose bodies had forgotten to stop functioning. They ate without tasting, slept without dreaming, and interacted with others without forming any genuine connections. The treatment of wounded gladiators revealed another layer of the arena's cruelty. Those who were injured but likely to recover were given the best available medical care, their wounds cleaned and dressed by skilled physicians who understood the financial value of keeping valuable fighters alive. But gladiators who suffered injuries that would permanently impair their performance faced a different fate entirely. Marcus witnessed this firsthand when a young Gallic warrior named Brennus suffered a spinal injury during a fall in the arena. The man's legs were paralyzed, making him useless as a fighter, but still conscious and aware of his situation. Rather than providing him with care or attempting to find some other use for his services, the arena administrators simply stopped feeding him. He was left to die slowly of starvation and thirst, while other gladiators were forced to listen to his increasingly weak pleas for mercy. The message was clear. Gladiators existed only to provide entertainment through violence. Once they could no longer fulfill that function, they became worthless and disposable. There was no retirement plan for arena fighters, no provision for those who had served their purpose and could no longer perform. They were used up and discarded like any other piece of equipment that had outlived its usefulness. Even more disturbing was the treatment of gladiators who won their freedom through exceptional performance. The stories told in the barracks spoke of legendary fighters who had been granted their liberty after achieving a certain number of victories or performing some particularly spectacular feat of combat. These tales were used to maintain hope among the newer fighters, giving them something to strive for beyond mere survival. But the reality was far different from the legend. Marcus learned from Commodus that freed gladiators faced a cruel paradox. They had no skills other than fighting, no place in normal society, and no way to earn a living, except by returning to the arena as volunteer fighters. Freedom, when it was granted at all, was often just another form of imprisonment disguised as mercy. I've seen dozens of men win their freedom, Commodus explained during one of their nocturnal conversations. Most of them are back within a year volunteering to fight again because they can't survive in the outside world. They've been so thoroughly broken by arena life that they can't function anywhere else. They return because the arena is the only place where their skills have value, where their existence has meaning, even if that meaning is death. The psychological effects of prolonged arena combat were visible in the behavior of veteran gladiators. Many developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to give them some sense of control over their fundamentally uncontrollable situation. Some would only eat certain foods before fights. Others performed complex sequences of exercises or prayers, and still others relied on lucky charms or amulets that they believed would protect them from death. But perhaps the most common coping mechanism was the development of fatalistic acceptance that bordered on death wish. Many long-surviving gladiators spoke openly of wanting their ordeal to end, of hoping that their next opponent would be skilled enough to grant them the release of death. They continued fighting not because they wanted to live, but because they lacked the courage to deliberately lose and end their suffering. Marcus found himself walking this same dark path as the weeks passed, and he survived fight after fight. Each victory brought him closer to the psychological breaking point that he observed in the veteran fighters, and he could feel his own humanity slipping away piece by piece with every life he took. The farmer who had once worried about crop yields and tax collectors was becoming something else entirely, a creature that existed only to kill for the entertainment of the mob. The physical toll of repeated arena combat was equally devastating. Even minor wounds accumulated over time, leaving scars that limited mobility and created weak points that future opponents could exploit. Marcus's body began to resemble a map of near-death experiences, a network of marks and deformities that told the story of each fight he had survived. But the most insidious damage was the gradual erosion of hope. New gladiators arrived at the school filled with desperate optimism, convinced that they could beat the odds and somehow escape their fate. But as they watched fight after fight, saw friend after friend die in the sand, and felt their own bodies breaking down under the constant stress of combat, that hope slowly withered and died. Marcus observed this process in the newer recruits who arrived to replace fallen fighters. Their eyes still held traces of the men they had been before the arena claimed them. But he could watch that light fade day by day as they adjusted to the reality of their situation. Within weeks, they began to resemble the hollow-eyed veterans who had survived longer but lost more in the process. The arena's grip on its fighters extended even beyond death. The bodies of slain gladiators were often put on display as warnings to others, their corpses left to rot in public spaces as reminders of what awaited those who failed to provide adequate entertainment. Families were rarely allowed to claim the remains of their loved ones, being told instead that the men they had known no longer existed. They had become property of the state when they entered the arena, and their corpses remained state property after death. Even the rare gladiator, who managed to survive long enough to earn his freedom, found that the arena's influence followed him for the rest of his life. Former fighters were marked men, recognized wherever they went as killers who had entertained the mob through violence. They were both feared and despised by ordinary citizens, treated as creatures who existed somewhere between human and animal. The ultimate cruelty of the arena system was its complete purposelessness. The gladiators did not die for any noble cause or higher principle. They died purely for entertainment, to satisfy the bloodlust of crowds who had nothing better to do with their afternoons than watch men kill each other for sport. Their deaths meant nothing, accomplished nothing, and were forgotten as soon as the next entertainment began. As Marcus lay on his straw mattress that night, listening to the sounds of other gladiators crying, praying, or simply breathing in the darkness, he understood that he was trapped in a machine designed to consume human lives for no purpose other than spectacle. He had won his first fight, but that victory had only guaranteed that he would have to fight again and again until eventually his luck ran out and he joined the countless others whose blood had soaked into the arena sand. The realization that there was no escape, no hope, no future beyond an endless series of increasingly desperate battles settled over him like a shroud. He was no longer living. He was simply postponing death while gradually losing everything that had once made him human. The arena had claimed another victim, even though his heart still beat and his lungs still drew breath. In the morning, training would resume. New opponents would be selected. The machine would continue its relentless operation, grinding human beings into entertainment for the amusement of the mob, and Marcus would be part of it. Until the day when his name was finally crossed off the list of the living and added to the much longer roster of the dead. Victory in the arena was not triumph. It was merely a different form of defeat, one that condemned the winner to repeat the process until he finally lost. The only true victory was death, because death at least offered the promise of peace, while survival guaranteed only more suffering, more killing, and more gradual erosion of everything that had once made existence worthwhile. The crowd would cheer for blood tomorrow, just as they had today, and Marcus would provide it. Until the day when it was his own blood staining the sand, while another gladiator walked away to face the same terrible choice between dying quickly or living in hell. 3 years had passed since Marcus first walked into the arena, and the man who now bore that name was unrecognizable from the farmer who had once worried about crop rotations and tax collectors. His body was a map of violence, dozens of scars crisscrossed his torso and limbs, each one marking a moment when death had come within inches of claiming him. His left shoulder had been shattered by a warhammer and healed improperly, limiting his range of motion. 2 fingers on his right hand were missing, severed by Aratorius's net weights during his 15th fight. His face bore the permanent marks of combat. A deep scar across his forehead where a helmet had split. A twisted nose broken so many times it no longer sat straight, and eyes that reflected nothing but emptiness. But the physical damage was nothing compared to what the arena had done to his mind and soul. The Marcus who had once loved his wife and children, who had found joy in simple pleasures like a successful harvest or a shared meal, no longer existed. In his place was something that looked human, but had transcended ordinary emotion to become a creature of pure survival instinct. He had killed 43 men in the arena, and their faces no longer haunted his dreams, because he had trained himself to stop seeing them as human beings. The gladiator barracks had become his entire world, a place where men existed in a state of suspended animation between fights, neither truly living nor completely dead. New recruits still arrived regularly to replace those who had fallen, but Marcus barely bothered to learn their names anymore. Most would be dead within weeks, and forming attachments to the doomed had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The training routine continued with mechanical precision. The same exercises, the same mock combats, the same systematic brutalization designed to transform human beings into entertaining killers. But Marcus now moved through these drills like a sleepwalker, his body performing the necessary motions, while his mind retreated to a place where pain and fear could not follow. He had achieved the state that Commodus had described years earlier, becoming something beyond human emotion, a machine that existed only to fight and win and survive until the next fight. His reputation in the arena had grown with each victory. The crowd now knew his fighting style, and would cheer when his name was announced, not out of affection but out of appreciation for the quality of violence he provided. Betting odds favored him in most matchups, and wealthy Romans would pay premium prices for seats when he was scheduled to fight. He had become a brand, a commodity, a source of reliable entertainment for people who had never worked a day in their lives but demanded spectacular death as the price of their attention. But success in the arena was a curse disguised as a blessing. The more famous Marcus became, the more challenging his opponents became. Arena organizers knew that crowds would grow bored watching him defeat inexperienced fighters, so they began matching him against other veterans, other survivors who had clawed their way through dozens of fights and accumulated their own collections of scars and dead enemies. These fights were different from the early matches against frightened recruits or desperate criminals. When 2 experienced gladiators faced each other, the combat became a chess match played with deadly weapons, each man trying to exploit weaknesses while protecting his own vulnerabilities. The margins for error were microscopic, and a single moment of inattention or bad luck could end a career that had taken years to build. Marcus's 44th fight was against a Murmillo named Titus Maximus, who had survived 38 arena encounters and earned a reputation for methodical, efficient killing. The man was everything Marcus had become: emotionally dead, technically perfect, and completely committed to survival at any cost. When they faced each other across the blood-stained sand, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected the monster he had become. The fight lasted nearly an hour, both men too experienced and cautious to make the quick mistakes that ended most arena combats. They circled each other like predators, testing defenses and looking for openings while the crowd grew increasingly excited by the quality of the violence on display. These were not desperate amateurs flailing at each other with unfamiliar weapons. These were professionals who had reduced killing to an art form. Marcus felt nothing during the combat. No fear or excitement or anger. Just the cold calculation that had kept him alive through dozens of previous encounters. He noted the slight favor Titus showed for his left side, probably due to an old injury that still affected his mobility. He observed the way his opponent's breathing changed when pressed against the arena wall, suggesting possible lung damage from a previous fight. He cataloged weaknesses like a physician studying symptoms, preparing to exploit them when the opportunity arose. The decisive moment came when Titus overcommitted to a thrust aimed at Marcus's exposed ribs. The attack was perfectly executed and would have ended the fight instantly if it had connected, but Marcus had been feinting weakness on that side for 20 minutes, waiting for exactly this opportunity. He shifted his weight at the last possible second, letting the blade slide past him while bringing his own gladius up in a rising cut that opened Titus's throat from ear to ear. Blood fountained across the sand as Titus dropped his weapons and clutched at his ruined neck, his eyes wide with surprise that his long run of victories had finally ended. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his life pumping out through the massive wound while the crowd roared its approval of the spectacular finish. Marcus stood over the body, breathing heavily through the slits in his helmet, waiting for the Emperor's decision even though it was purely ceremonial. Men who died from wounds like that could not be saved, and mercy was irrelevant when the victim was already beyond help. But the ritual had to be observed, so he waited while Domitian made his theatrical gesture of turning his thumb downward, officially sealing a fate that had been decided the moment the blade opened Titus's throat. As slaves rushed forward to drag away the corpse and rake fresh sand over the bloodstains, Marcus walked toward the arena exit with the mechanical gait that had become his normal way of moving. Another victory. Another reprieve from death. Another step closer to the inevitable moment when his own luck would run out, and some younger, faster, hungrier fighter would send him to join the countless others who had died for the entertainment of the mob. But something was different this time. As he passed through the tunnel leading back to the gladiator areas, Marcus felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if some weight he had been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted. It took him several minutes to identify the sensation, and when he finally did, the recognition filled him with a mixture of relief and terror. He no longer cared whether he lived or died. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt like a kind of liberation. For 3 years, he had fought with desperate intensity to preserve a life that had long since ceased to have any meaning or value. He had killed and killed and killed again, always telling himself that survival was worth any price, that tomorrow might bring some change in his circumstances that would make the suffering worthwhile. But standing in that tunnel, listening to the crowd's excitement over his latest victory, Marcus understood that there would be no rescue, no reprieve, no return to the life he had lost when he signed that contract to pay his family's debts. He would fight until he could fight no more, and then he would die in the sand like all the others, his death cheered by people who did not know his name and would forget him before his blood had time to dry. The medical examination after the fight was routine. A few minor cuts cleaned and dressed, joints checked for damage, pronouncement of fitness for future combat. But the physician, a Greek slave named Hippocrates who had been tending gladiator wounds for 15 years, noticed something different in Marcus's demeanor. "You fought well today," the doctor said, as he applied a salve to a cut on Marcus's forearm. Titus was dangerous. Many thought he might finally be the one to end your run. Marcus said nothing, staring at the stone wall with the same empty expression he had worn for months. But there was something new in his silence, a quality of finality that the physician had seen before in other long-surviving gladiators. "How many more do you think you have in you?" Hippocrates asked, his voice carefully neutral. It was a question that could not be answered honestly, without acknowledging the fundamental hopelessness of gladiator life, but it was also a question that every veteran fighter asked himself after every victory. "One," Marcus replied without hesitation. Maybe 2. My shoulder is getting worse, and my reflexes are slower than they were last year. Soon some young fighter with quick hands and nothing to lose will catch me making a mistake. The physician nodded, understanding the mathematics of arena survival better than anyone. Will you try to time it? Choose your moment? It was a delicate way of asking whether Marcus intended to deliberately lose his next fight, to take control of his own death rather than leaving it to chance. Many gladiators reached a point where they preferred suicide to the endless cycle of killing and waiting to be killed. But the arena offered few opportunities for self-destruction that would not be obvious to the crowd and officials. No, Marcus said after a long pause. I'll fight to win until I can't anymore. But I won't pretend it matters. The conversation ended there, but both men understood what had been discussed. Marcus had reached the psychological breaking point that claimed all gladiators who survived long enough. The moment when the will to live was finally overwhelmed by the futility of survival. He would continue to fight because that was what he had been trained to do, but he would no longer suffer the emotional agony of caring about the outcome. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's fighting style began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. He became more aggressive, taking risks that he would never have accepted during his earlier career. He still won his fights, but the victories came at a higher cost in terms of injuries and exhaustion. Observers who understood gladiatorial combat recognized the signs. Marcus was burning through his remaining physical and mental reserves at an unsustainable pace. The change was most obvious during his 47th fight. A match against twin brothers who fought as a team using nets and tridents. In the past, Marcus would have approached such a handicap match with extreme caution, using his experience and defensive skills to survive until his opponents made mistakes. But this time, he went on the offensive immediately, charging the brothers with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The fight was over in minutes. Marcus absorbed several serious wounds while cutting down both opponents with a savagery that shocked even the bloodthirsty crowd. When it ended, he stood swaying in the center of the arena, blood streaming from gashes on his arms and chest. His breathing labored and his movements unsteady. The crowd cheered his victory, but experienced observers could see that he was fighting like a man who no longer expected to survive. The injuries from that fight took weeks to heal, and when Marcus returned to training, it was obvious that his body was beginning to fail him. His left arm, damaged during the twin fight, could no longer support the full weight of his shield for extended periods. His endurance was noticeably reduced, and he tired more quickly during practice sessions. Most telling of all, he had begun to show the subtle signs of brain damage that affected many gladiators who had absorbed too many head blows over their careers. Moments of confusion, difficulty with balance, and occasional tremors in his hands. The arena administrators were not blind to these changes. Marcus was still valuable as a fighter, but his decline was accelerating, and they began to plan for his eventual replacement. Newer gladiators were given more prominent fights to build their reputations, while Marcus was increasingly matched against opponents who would provide entertaining combat regardless of the outcome. His 49th fight was scheduled for the Ides of September, during games celebrating the Emperor's birthday. His opponent was to be a young Thracian named Darius who had won his first 12 arena encounters and was being promoted as the next great gladiator sensation. The matchup was designed to be a passing of the torch. The veteran's experience against the newcomer's speed and hunger, age against youth, the dying champion against his inevitable replacement. Marcus knew exactly what the fight represented, and he prepared for it with the same methodical attention to detail that had carried him through 3 years of arena combat. But there was a difference in his preparation this time. He was not training to win, but to provide a fitting end to his career. If he was going to die in the arena, he intended to die well, to give the crowd the kind of spectacular violence they had come to expect from him. The night before the fight, Marcus lay on his straw mattress, listening to the familiar sounds of the gladiator barracks. Men breathing, crying, praying, or simply existing in the darkness between one day and the next. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about his family, about the wife and children he had left behind to enter this world of sanctified murder. His youngest child would be 4 years old now, old enough to ask questions about the father who had disappeared before his birth. Marcus wondered what Anna told the children about him, whether she said he was dead, or simply gone, or perhaps something worse. He hoped she had found another man to help raise his children, someone who could give them the love and stability that he would never be able to provide. The thought should have filled him with sadness or regret, but Marcus found that he felt nothing at all. The part of him that had once been capable of love had been systematically destroyed by 3 years of systematic brutality. He could remember caring about his family the same way he could remember the taste of fresh bread, or the feeling of clean clothes against his skin, as distant sensations from a previous life that no longer had any relevance to his current existence. In the morning, he would walk into the arena for the last time. Whether he lived or died, his career as a gladiator was effectively over. His body was too damaged to continue much longer, and his mind had retreated so far from normal human emotion that he could barely remember what it felt like to be truly alive. The arena had consumed him completely, leaving behind only a hollow shell that could still hold a sword and remember how to kill. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the small window high in the barracks wall, Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to watch the sun rise over his own fields, to feel hope for the future, to believe that life had meaning beyond the next fight. But those memories were like trying to grasp smoke. The harder he reached for them, the more quickly they slipped away. Soon the guards would come to wake the gladiators assigned to fight that day. There would be the ritual meal, the blessing, the arming, the procession to the arena. The crowd would cheer, the emperor would watch, and blood would soak into the sand once again. But for Marcus, it would all be happening to someone else. Some creature that wore his face, but no longer possessed his soul. The arena had created him, shaped him, and now it would claim him. That was the only certainty in a world where everything else was subject to the whims of fate and the bloodlust of the mob. He was no longer a man, no longer even really alive in any meaningful sense. He was simply another piece of equipment in the great machine that transformed human beings into entertainment. And like all such equipment, he would be used until he broke and then discarded without ceremony or regret. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to the suffering of men. And in a few hours, the games would begin again.